Hello, and welcome to Air Supply, a podcast from JO Collective. My name is Joshua O'Connor. It's not particularly thought-provoking to say what I'm about to say, but it is really important to learn from people with whom we disagree. And I'm sure that for many of you, my guest on this week's podcast will be someone who you don't agree with. Steve Baker was previously the MP for Wickham in the UK for 14 years. Served as a minister in the Cabinet Office, the Northern Ireland Office, and the Department for Exiting the EU. He also ran several notable campaigns as a backbench MP. Many people will know him due to Brexit, and for that, he is one of the most consequential politicians of our time. But Steve, for all the debating and arguing and parliamentary political games that he was inevitably involved in to further the causes of which he believed, is an incredibly reasonable, gentle and thoughtful person. And I couldn't help but feel that he'd ended up in this position somewhat against the odds. He had some really amazing insights into leadership across the military, where he started, software engineering, where he spent time, and then politics, where he's been for the past 14 years. Whatever you think, whatever your views are on politics or left, right, up, down, doesn't matter. I would urge you to listen to this. I hope you enjoy. A lot of people know Steve Baker from 2010 to today, and there's been many events in between that have made you a very well-known public figure. But perhaps just quickly, I'd love to hear about your time before that and what brought you into Parliament.
Well, Joshua, first of all, thank you very much indeed for having me on. I'm really genuinely honoured to have this opportunity to talk about leadership with some trepidation, because I know the sort of reaction I get. So, yeah, I grew up in Cornwall, working class kid from Cornwall. My dad was a building site carpenter, and my mum was an administrative clerk who rose to run a charity. My stepfather, after the divorce, was an open cast mine worker, so in a normal sort of background. First from the family to go to university on a scholarship into the Air Force. So I became an engineer officer, graduated from initial officer training with as a prize winner for leadership, which was great. And 3 tours, and then the dot-com boom was happening. So I thought, I could sit here doing office work on aero engines, which I didn't really enjoy. I wanted to do defence intelligence trials and weapons and avionics. Or I could go off and get into the dot-com boom, try and make my fortune. So I left the Air Force, did an MSc in computer science and got into business software until I got so fed up with politics, I thought emigrate, moan or stand. Obviously, I decided to stand with no political experience. 2.5 years later, incredibly, 2.5 years later, I was elected to Parliament with no prior political experience. And I'm afraid the rest is history.
First of all, you've described yourself, and you've been described as someone who has been the person to stand up for their principles, to do the right thing, not necessarily the popular thing, during crises.
Yeah.
I think you said that colleagues sent for you 4 times to provide leadership through crisis. I assume that was Brexit, COVID, several other things as well.
So the way I would say it's 4 times is I did Conservatives for Britain, which was the run-up to the referendum. I then did the ERG, I would count as the second time, because the Conservatives for Britain went well, so they asked me to do the ERG. Which, by the way, when I founded it, was supposed to unite the Conservative Party, and it was connected to lots of think tanks. People forget that phase of it, but by the by. And then COVID, and then net zero. It was actually Lord Lawson who asked me to do the net zero stuff, and I said yes, because it was Lord Lawson, who became a great friend and mentor to me, which is a privilege.
This is Nigel Lawson.
Yeah, Nigel Lawson, Margaret Thatcher's most famous chancellor. Yeah. A great man who spoke very kindly of me. But yeah, those were the 4 times, twice on the referendum, COVID and net zero.
Not everyone would want to put themselves through that.
I'm not sure I wanted to put myself through it. I don't think I knew what it was, what it was going to be before I did it, that's for sure.
But what is it about you that jumped towards that? Because I assume what you could have done is you could have entered Parliament in 2010. You could have gone with the party line, voted with the coalition, and then the Conservative government, probably got yourself a really good job in cabinet, and it all would have been fantastic and wonderful. What is it about you that said,
So,
no, I'm going to do something different?
Yeah, well, thank you. Well, there's an old phrase, you want to be someone or do something. And I came into politics to do something. And that something was to set right what I thought was an outrageous trespass on democracy. And that was that the Constitution for Europe was rammed through positively against the democratically expressed wishes of the electorate. And I've learned, long since, that people divide into two camps, the people who do care about this and the people who don't. And I've ceased to get upset that some people don't care about this. But a thing called the Constitution for Europe was rejected in referenda and then was rammed through with using a device to avoid having referenda. The Irish were forced to vote twice. And at that point, I thought, hang on, I thought I lived in a democracy. What on earth is going on? So I was propelled into politics as, in a sense, as the last straw, that we must have a referendum because it is not a legitimate source of power. The European Union is not a legitimate source of power without a referendum. So I was determined to get one. And that meant that I would not be on treading the career path to ministerial office because I knew I'd have to rebel. The other things that drove me in were unjust wars. I think it's worth remembering that we ended up complicit in extraordinary rendition, that is shipping people around the world for torture. And there's an absolute international prohibition on torture. I did not join the armed forces so that the United Kingdom could be complicit in torture. I mean, Alistair Campbell, who I've met, he thought it was funny to sit down next to me, and I did not. I had to have dinner with him, and well, he turned up afterwards. I had to have dinner with Cherie Blair and Tony Blair. And Cherie was too round. She kept scowling at me over Brexit and being mean over the dinner, course of the dinner. And eventually I said to her, Lady Blair, whatever, said, I can reply in kind if you like. We can talk about the Iraq War and extraordinary rendition and your husband's role in all those things. We can talk about how my wife flew battlefield Kazovac in the Iraq War and I'm jolly lucky she made it back. And I can reply to you in kind if you want. Or we can just let bygones be bygones and have a nice dinner to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. And which do you think she chose? She chose to just shut up. And we had a dinner. But I had to sit there with those guys. But I got into politics because Lisbon Treaty, war, torture, and actually because of the monetary system, manufacturing mass injustice. So, very happy to talk about all those things. But because I got into politics motivated by purpose and a desire to achieve strategic goals, shifting the debate on monetary policy to stand against unjust wars, which people will find in my voting record, which itself was very hard, and to get us a referendum on the Lisbon Treaty. I never expected to be a minister. I have, of course, been a minister twice in 3 departments, so that was unexpected. But that is why I went about it that way. I was not born to be an MP. I think it is worth saying I am introverted almost to the point of agoraphobia, and I really do not like combat, and yet somehow I enjoy it.
Right.
But, I'm not a natural member of Parliament, but I do seem to be able to do it.
How much of the ability to do that stems from your background, not coming from, a gilded lineage that many other MPs come from, and so I imagine you've had to struggle and battle to get far in life, and then also going into the military and being an engineer as well, so being both disciplined and highly logical and strategic in the way that you think.
Yeah, so just breaking that down, I don't really regard myself as having sort of struggled. I mean, I had two loving homes as a kid, and we weren't wealthy, but normal working class family, and then scholarship and all the rest of it. But I've certainly worked hard for the things I've achieved. I think what the Royal Air Force gave me was the privilege of formal leadership training for 6 months. The Armed Forces does give that real privilege. And the thing is, people are people wherever they are. Now, the Armed Forces, business and politics, and indeed government, are 3 different categories of human action, different institutional environments within which you lead. But the way that people are doesn't really change. People will recognise those institutions and adjust. So if you're in the armed forces, you know that in the end you're under command and you are going to have to do whatever the thing is. But you can't always be commanding people. I can't. If we were working in the armed forces and I was still commanding officer, I can't be constantly ordering you. That people make the mistake of thinking that military leadership is authoritarian. And it only in the ultimate analysis, when it's in contact with the enemy, is military leadership absolutely directive. And I was an engineer officer, I wasn't in combat. They need to be treated well all the time, whoever they are. They need to be engaged. They need to be given the opportunity to make their work their own. I mean, my approach has always been to hire brilliant people, show them the problem, give them some rules and guidelines, and let them solve them. And funny enough, people who work for me always love their work because they make it their own, and it's worth coming in every day. But that was true in the Royal Air Force, true in software businesses, and true in politics. And it's because actually people are the same everywhere. It's just that the environment in which they work is categorically different in terms of incentives and power structures.
Yeah, I'm interested about that incentives point because in politics you have, in business it's usually clear what the incentives are. It's kind of linked to financial reward or whether that's long-term or short-term and, career progression, etc., shareholder return. However, kind of across the whole supply chain of people, there tends to be a common theme. How does that differ in politics, and what different types of leadership skills are required in politics? Because it feels like financial incentives, you would hope, are not there in politics. It's something different. So what is that about?
People don't go into politics for money. I mean, it has to be said that an MP's salary is very substantially more than twice the median pay in the UK. But it was a big pay cut for me, and I haven't recovered it yet. So, that it is. You don't go into it for money. The single biggest categorical difference, which makes everything vastly more trying in politics than it is either in business or the armed forces, is that you do not actually have authority over other politicians. Your parliamentary staff are your staff, and they have to be treated properly, but they are employees.
Yeah.
So that relationship is an employee-employer relationship, as you would expect. But when you're trying to lead other politicians, you don't have any authority over them. So you're leading without authority. If they don't want to follow you, that's the end of it. And as we've seen, I'm afraid, several times with the Conservative Party, if they wish to remove the Prime Minister, ultimately they can just remove the Prime Minister. Of course, in business, if somebody really doesn't want to work for the Chief Executive, they remove themselves. And this dynamic whereby you're, insofar as you have authority and power at all in politics, it originates, as it should, from the series of people who voted to put you there. It comes from the voters to the MPs then elect a leader. So it does mean that you're leading without authority, and particularly when you, like as I was, if you're the rebel leader, or as somebody said, rebel commander. Guido Fawkes called me the rebel commander, which I'm afraid I do actually quite like that one. The CBI called me the general. Anyway, the point is, if you're in that position, that you're in rebellion, you haven't even got the patronage that the Prime Minister has, that you can give somebody a job in government, or you can make them appear after they've been in Parliament or whatever. So you have to lead people only where they want to go. So I realised after a while that some of the very senior colleagues that I used to go to very private meetings with were treating me like their private secretary, because they used to say, oh, he's a very good organiser. I thought, you know what, I am actually leading you here. But they don't, when you're a minister, when you're a Secretary of State, you just sort of hand-wavily say what you'd like, and then your private secretary talks to everybody to make it happen. And I think they thought that's what I was doing.
Right,
but what they didn't realise, there's a confession here, the steering group that I always set up, when I set up each of my big campaigns, there was a steering group of grandees, and their job was to manufacture authority, to set boundaries, to hold me to account. Because actually, if you've got one of these mobile phones in your hand with 150 MPs on a WhatsApp broadcast list, and once at least, I think I've done it more than once, on no notice, I put over 70 MPs in the rebel lobby. And they were all just, they were in the House of Commons, they were all just looking at me to see which way we should vote. And we hadn't discussed it before, and I just had to decide. And when you're in that position of power, the Prime Minister doesn't do that. The Prime Minister doesn't just decide as you approach a vote and press the button, but I did. And that,
but then how do you, when you're doing that, how do you get to the point where you have that followership and you've built consensus with your colleagues that they will essentially do what you want them to do?
How to Win Friends and Influence People is the absolute best book on handling people ever. Dale Carnegie. I wish I'd read it in my 20s or my teens rather than in my 40s. But never criticise, condemn or complain. Rule 1, no point. And try and always see the other person's point of view. The other things, other concepts I would use, and again, Tory MPs do not get this, servant leadership. I try to be your servant. particularly when you've got no authority, I want to find, where does Josh want to go? Can I help Josh get where he wants to go, along with these other people? Can I somehow find or manufacture a consensus that we're all going where we want to go? Because once you're leading people where they want to go, they're quite happy to go with you because you're just giving them what they want. So servant leadership is very important because then people don't even notice they're being led. And that is, I think, when you're really triumphing. When the team scarcely knows they're being led and yet actually they're going where you want them to go. That's where it gets really sophisticated, is when they weren't really sure that's where they wanted to go, but somehow you've got them to the point that they did want to go there and they don't notice that you're leading them there, and that's the tricky bit. And the third point is consistency, professional expertise, judgment, consistency. So people know that if they leave something in your hands, they're going to get a result that they can be proud of. So professional relationships, positive professional relationships, treating people how they should be treated, judgment and expertise and consistency. And actually, I chose those particular three because it's true in my experience, and I read it in the Harvard Business Review, and it does work. I'm afraid the research is right. And people have to know that if they leave a thing in your hands, they'll get what they want when you're leading without authority.
And what was driving you to take on that responsibility?
I suppose I can't help myself. If I've got a purpose in mind, I'm afraid I do tend to leap the parapet. You know, even when I was a kid, you know, the Cold War was on when I was a kid. I am that old. And so what can I do? I love aeroplanes. I'll join the Royal Air Force. But yeah, I mean, I care very deeply about society, and so my sense of purpose is I want to do something to make society a better place. Now, people who disagree with me about Brexit or COVID or whatever will say, well, how can you? But hang on, this is just a legitimate disagreement about ends. But I think most of us really care about ourselves, our families, our communities, our businesses, our co-workers. We genuinely do care about other people. It's a rare person who is uncaring about their colleagues and those around them. And I think when you're in a leadership position, it's being driven by that sense of purpose for what you're doing as an organisation and also the well-being of the people you're with. I think it's a rare and heartless company that's only where the individuals within it are only mobilised by profit. Now, of course, if one is doing a merger and acquisition, there's going to be redundancies. But how you go about it is a really important question.
Yes. And I'd be interested to understand how your decision-making framework has evolved since you were in the Air Force, because as you were saying that you didn't follow the party line, you made decisions based on principle.
Yeah.
When you are making those decisions, what do you take into account? Because I'm thinking there's your constituents who've voted you in Wickham. There's what the party wants and your party's values. There is this kind of gut instinct that people talk about, and actually, I think a lot of business decisions are made on gut instincts. And often, if you've got a lot of experience in doing something, you kind of think, I sort of know where this ends up, even if there's not data to prove it right now. And then also, kind of, any religious or spiritual or anything like that when you're voting in Parliament. How do you build that framework for yourself?
Well, the first thing I'll say is, although I flawed and fallen as I may be, I'm trying to be a devout Christian, but I would always say that anyone who's relying on their faith to get through a vote in the House of Commons is making a mistake. People are entitled to have representatives who can justify their decisions on secular grounds, and I always have. So I'd never fall back on my faith. My faith's very important to me. Ultimately, it's how I think we're all judged, but I wouldn't impose it on anybody else. And that's also reflected in my voting record. So I think just stepping back, I was never a scattergun rebel. There were people Heidi Allen used to rebel on anything that was coming up, and she used to, in the 2010 Parliament, she'd rebel against the Conservative Party on welfare measures.
She was a former Cambridgeshire MP, I believe.
She was.
Yeah,
and she defected to the Tiggers, but she was a scattergun rebel. You can see it but I wasn't. I was but purpose, and I was very clear. So I went into the election. I'd tell anybody what my view was on the European Union, and then I went after it. And people would say, well, you've got no right to do this. Well, hang on a minute. I did actually put on my election address what my view was. So as a rule, our constitution rests on the idea of party politics. the party puts forward a manifesto, and then if you're elected as the Member of Parliament on that party manifesto, overwhelmingly you should vote for what's in the manifesto. And that's a really important principle. I wrote in The Sun about this. It makes sure that people get the government they voted for. Now, the manifesto almost always comes out after nominations have closed. What that means is you as the candidate don't get to see the platform on which you're standing for election until it's too late to withdraw. And that's so politics is a filthy business. In other words, it's done deliberately to make sure that candidates have to stand on that election, that manifesto. But the point is, the public are entitled to think that if they vote Conservative, their Conservative Member of Parliament will vote for what's in the manifesto. So I've always been really very careful to do that and not to be a scattergun rebel. So like HS2, I said from the outset I was opposed to HS2, and then I led the first debate that opposed HS2 and voted against HS2. Why? Because the hierarchy of loyalties for an MP should be country, constituency, party. And in Buckinghamshire, I was the only backbench MP at the time in 2010, and Wickham was the only constituency that HS2 didn't tear through. But nevertheless, I did my duty by my county colleagues who were all in government, and so I opposed HS2 on behalf of Buckinghamshire. But that's the way it worked. I put it in my election address that I was opposed to HS2, which is a way of exempting yourself from that commitment. You can't exempt yourself from everything, and then you go and do it. But once we got into Brexit, again, when you ask about these things, it is political. The way democracy works, it's not that you're constantly consulting 75,000 people. You can't do it. What you have to do is think, well, what do I think that my electors in Wickham would want me to do? What do I think is in the best interests of everyone, irrespective of how they vote? And then I'll do that. If you've actually got to choose, because it's not in the manifesto. So I really thought it was important that we not have a Corbyn-McDonnell-led government. And I'm absolutely certain that if we'd allowed Theresa May's Brexit deal to go through, we would have had a Corbyn-McDonnell-led government, and it would have ruined this country for the rest of all of our lives. That's my view.
Yeah.
And I whatever people's view was on the referendum result, I was never going to vote for that deal because I could see the Conservative Party would terminally split as it did over the Corn Laws, came back after a long period. And we would have had Corbyn and McDonnell. They would have been an absolute disaster. So we stood to the last on it.
Because I rewatched a documentary that you were featured in with Laura Kuenssberg, I think. And first of all, it feels like an awfully long time ago. I mean, literally, like almost like a different world when those things were happening. I'm sure it's not for you.
No, it is. Honestly, it is. I mean, I couldn't believe it when I realised it's 5 years since COVID broke out.
Yeah, almost to the day, isn't it? So yeah, I mean, it's obviously that's pre-COVID and it's a different world. But for you, voting against Theresa May's deal, it felt like you had gone through a long process of really thinking about it. And it was actually an emotional thing because of many reasons, which I'd like to understand, but you were really wrestling with it and then ultimately decided to vote against it. Why was it so emotional for you?
Well, it was first and foremost rational. I mean, it is a fact that human beings can only take decisions because of emotion. That is a physiological fact.
Yeah.
I'm a passionate person and I don't apologise for that. I have great fellow feeling. But it wasn't an emotional decision. It was a strategic decision. So difference between strategy and tactics. Tactics is how you win the battle. Yeah. Strategy is how you string the battles together to win the war. And the strategy was to get out of the European Union, which means not being within the European Union's legal framework. And what Theresa May's deal did was leave us still within substantial parts of the EU's legal framework, which is why we called it Brexit in name only. But the problem was, for people who really cared about it, they would have, again, goodness knows I've seen this in Northern Ireland. Unfortunately, on constitutional questions, people get very, very, very committed to the point that it's for others who don't share their views, it's beyond all reason. And just for me, detaching from it, it was just a matter of strategy. If we're going to have a decent country outside the EU without a Corbyn-McDonnell-led government, we have to reject that deal. I mean, you might remember that Theresa May actually got quite close to doing a deal with the Labour Party just to get her deal through. Because, of course, she felt that the economy was going to collapse unless we did this. And I disagreed. It turns out I was right. But we didn't know. So in terms of, if you mean about emotion, the toll it took on me, I had to bear a responsibility which secretaries of state and prime ministers do not bear. I sometimes had to decide alone which way I would ask 130 MPs to vote in the height of a national crisis that was testing our constitution almost to destruction and determining which way our country would go for 100 years, 200, forever. And that took a lot of a toll. That's a hell of a stress. It's a stress no one should have to bear. As I say, even prime ministers don't do it. The prime minister doesn't sit on the front bench with their phone in their hand deciding which way the Conservative Party's going to vote. They've got a long process and lots of advice and the chief whip and their other ministers. But doing it as a rebel, you do it unsupported. So I suppose in terms of the general lesson with leadership is sometimes it is just tough being a leader. Because sometimes you just have got to decide. Now, I hope nobody listening to this ever has to do what I had to do. And I never have to do it again, I'm sure I won't. But it is just tough being a leader. And what I would say is important people get the right support to get through the ordinary decisions that have to be made.
And why was it that you support network or a board, as it would be in business, to help you make those decisions?
So let me be just really clear. I'm talking about the cusp of it, when it really counted. Because politics is war minus the shooting. There's an old saying that war is a continuation of politics by other means. Clausewitz. Turn it on its head. Politics is war minus the shooting. It's got all the visceral sense of conflict, but without the violence. It's horrible when you really get into it. People want it to be nice. It's not going to be nice. It's awful when it's serious. And it's almost always serious. War minus the shooting. So when I set these things up, I did set up boards. So typically a Steve Baker campaign in Parliament would have first and foremost the steering group of senior figures, authority, boundaries, scrutiny of me, because it was a lot of power to wield. Then it would have a group of officers, and they'd be like the lieutenants who actually do the work. And there would be 6 officers of the ERG or the Net Zero Scrutiny Group or the COVID Recovery Group. And the officers and I would decide day by day what was going to go, what story was going to be in the newspaper tomorrow. The steering group would meet once a week to review what we were doing. And then there'd be a big group with all the MPs in it. And, we'd be constantly canvassing their opinions, asking them to take decisions, inviting them to go on the media. But I would set up a board. The board was the steering group. The C-suite, if you like, was the officers. And then the team was everybody else. So I'd almost always would set up an outreach group as well, which was people who were not MPs who could amplify a message. I mean, a Steve Baker set of WhatsApp groups with all these people, it is a thing to behold.
Complex, yeah.
Yeah, but I did set up a board. But the point is that if you're approaching a decision which you can see coming, like it's meaningful vote 1 on Theresa May's deal next week, of course, the steering group meets and discusses all the ins and outs in a very structured way, taking expert advice where we could get it. And then we'd hold a plenary of everybody who's on our side, and everybody'd stand up and make their opinion known. And then me and Jacob, as it was in the height of it, would make our recommendation on behalf of the steering group to all those MPs, and we'd decide together. So that would be the normal decision-making process, really collegiate, really inclusive. The reason that I'm sort of waving my phone about is that sometimes, because it's war minus the shooting, the government would just change the business.
Right.
So when the government just changes the business, trying to catch us out, what do? You either let them win the battle or you go for it. And so I would just, if I had to just decide or lose, well, I'd just decide.
Yeah.
And the trick for me personally was having through consistency, judgment, and positive relationships, having accumulated sufficient capital with my colleagues that when I did, on the few but several occasions where I did have to decide on my own and just press the button, that people would just go into the lobby because I asked them. But that's pretty unusual.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like there's a lot of pressure.
Well, it did cost me my mental health, and I talked about that frankly. That I absolutely was exhausted by the time we got re-elected in 2019, and it was clear we didn't have a Corbyn-McDonnell government. We were going to get out properly, and we did have a chance to set the country on a better thing, and then COVID hit.
Yeah.
But I absolutely needed a break. And then I remember being in committee room 14, and COVID was happening, and colleagues saying to me, Graham Brady and I had set up an ad hoc operation around a piece on the Coronavirus Act. And colleagues said, Steve, we need an organisation. And I remember leaning there with a face a bit like this, thinking, oh no, I know where this goes. I know what this is like. And overnight, the next night, I set up the COVID recovery group and invited Mark Harper to chair it. So, yeah, but by the time we'd done COVID, I was so exhausted and stressed out by it. Because, of course, COVID was the lives of millions of people. I mean, if Brexit wasn't bad enough, COVID was actually, am I recommending a course of action which might kill millions? That was literally what we were thinking.
What's interesting is that from the outside, a lot of the time it seems that a lot of MPs don't have a huge amount of power, and it's basically a talking shop.
They don't. It is.
That they're kind of going to vote one way, which is fine, and that's, I guess, how a two-party system works and means that you can get stuff done. But equally, there's people like you that seem to that are kind of fundamental leaders, but who are not in Downing Street or not on Labour HQ or CCHQ.
Well,
et cetera.
you ought to get some of the chief whips in. Somebody on another occasion ought to get some of the chief whips in. But definitely they could tell whether I was on the back benches or in government. And they preferred it when I was in government. The way our system ought to work is that the Prime Minister should have the power, based on the manifesto, and the MPs in Parliament to get their agenda through. And only, as in the case of Keir Starmer and his welfare reforms, his MPs were not expecting to have to put in place the kind of welfare reforms and cuts to, for example, personal independence payment that we had to put through in 2010. So now Keir Starmer faces the biggest rebellion of his premiership because a bunch of Labour MPs are going to have to do a bunch of things that Labour MPs don't like doing. And he's going to tell them to do it, and some of them will rebel. And there's letters being written and all the rest of it. And I know how it goes. Now, the big difference between them and me is I could always count on Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell talking about supping with a long spoon with the devil, because I was determined they weren't going to govern the country. But Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell were Eurosceptics. Yes. Why? This is how dangerous it was. They wanted to be out of the EU in order to implement their communist paradise. Whereas, of course, I wanted to be out of the EU in order to implement my libertarian paradise.
Yeah, I always thought that there was a straight that you and the kind of far left of the Labour Party were strange bedfellows in that both had been historically very, very Eurosceptic.
Yeah.
I mean, interestingly, where then you really differ, and I think in my day-to-day life, I'm speaking to business leaders who are increasingly pessimistic about the UK economy. There's the immediate thing around kind of national insurance that is coming in a month, but also the perceived long-term sustainability of how much money we're borrowing and how we are, borrowing from the future, and so from kids, grandkids, etc., and whether or not that money needs to be paid back, and how that will affect the economy in the here and now, and then lastly, why we can't seem to get any growth in the economy.
So I just reviewed an amazing book by my friend Lord John Moynihan called The Return to Growth, which deals with all of these things. I would really recommend people buy a copy of the 2 volumes and go through it. The unfunded pension liabilities of the state pension and the public sector pensions, when you take them into account, they don't add to tens of % to the national debt. They multiply it by several times.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
People will find the diagrams easy enough by searching my feed on X. But we're talking trillions of pounds. And when you look at the Office for Budget Responsibility's Fiscal Sustainability Report, what happens is spending in the next few decades races away while revenues stagnate. I'm afraid this is the bad news bit. What is happening in the world, the whole Western world, is a profound crisis and unravelling of the social democratic consensus which has existed since the end of the Second World War. In 1971, I'm sorry, it's a long story, Nixon closed the gold window. And that severed the last link which anchored the creation of money as debt.
Yeah.
And when you look at the figures, which I published papers on it, you look at the figures, since 1971, we have lived in a categorically different monetary environment to the monetary environment which got us through the Industrial Revolution. During the 19th century, money not only held but increased its value. There were perturbations and things which would have felt like crises, but when you look at the figures, money held its value throughout the Industrial Revolution. Capitalism worked the way it should. Goods became more abundant, cheaper, higher quality, just like TVs do, for example, now, and computers.
Yeah.
You get a bit of inflation as we go through the First and Second World War. But so money's value is basically a flat line on a linear scale. when you get to 1971, you basically go vertical. The value of money collapses.
And this is when 1971. That was when essentially the government could just start printing money based on. Not so. It was no longer linked to gold. So £1 of gold was worth £1. I know it wasn't.
To just simplify, after the monetary turmoil inherent during the Second World War, there was a conference called Bretton Woods, which set up a system where the world's currencies were tied to gold and gold was tied to the dollar, and that was designed to. It was a managed system, but it was designed to try and maintain purchasing power. But Nixon couldn't afford the spending of the Vietnam War and his welfare programs, or accumulated welfare programs in the US. People think the US doesn't have any welfare programs. It's got huge welfare programs. So he ended the last link to gold, and that released an enormous torrent of new credit that's washed through our society. Between 1997 and 2010, the money supply in the UK tripled. And it's a great accelerating rush to destruction of the global financial crisis. That's why Labour thought they'd abolish boom and bust, because credit was cheap and continuously expanding. And Hayek talked about this in his Nobel lecture. This is the frustration for me. The economics profession is profoundly broken. There's something wrong with their method and their knowledge of time and the importance of information that's not available to you to them because it's in our heads, that makes them go wrong on the interests. On the interest rate. We've ended up with an economics profession who think it's legitimate to centrally plan interest rates. And it's not. It's no more legitimate to do that than any other price. But I get ahead of myself. The point to business leaders is, I'm afraid, whether they like it or not, we're going to live in interesting times. And I'm sorry, it's not my fault. It's the unfolding of 100 years of growing state expenditure, which couldn't be honestly funded through taxation. So we've borrowed and borrowed and borrowed, but now we've accumulated liabilities which are a multiple of the national debt, state unfunded pension liabilities and public sector pension liabilities. And in our lifetimes, probably in about the next 10 years, those liabilities are going to become unaffordable. But if you look back to the period from now back to the global financial crisis, you can see how we got through it, QE. We've gone from using money expansion through debt, the banking system lending money into existence, to using QE. So we got through COVID because the Bank of England printed all the money necessary to buy the bonds the government was issuing. So we didn't really borrow that money. It was, two arms of the state issuing the bonds and buying the bonds with new money. But people in the middle got very rich out of that money washing through.
Yes.
Now that's a very important point if we can say yes to that, because where's the justice? Where's the justice in some people getting vastly wealthy out of QE when other people are struggling to buy a house, doing a decent day's work as a nurse or a building site carpenter or whatever? Unfortunately, 50 years of chronically expansionary monetary policy has sown amazingly wide-ranging seeds of injustice, which now people can feel, most acutely in the price of housing, and it's blowing up everywhere. This, I'm afraid, to me, this is the root cause. There's a number of causes, but this is one of the most important root causes of the radicalism of Trump, Farage, Alternative for Deutschland. These radical parties are arising because social processes have been radically disrupted by cheap credit and QE. Now, that means for businesses, I'm sorry, politics is really going to matter, and your leadership's going to really matter, you business people's leadership. Because Andy Haldane, former chief economist of the Bank of England, a man I know quite well, his mentor at university is a personal friend of mine, one of the world's best monetary scholars. Andy said, we have deliberately blown the biggest bond market bubble in history. Does anyone think that's burst yet? People can find my book on the subject on my website, but the bubble hasn't burst yet. It will burst.
Yeah. And so that's a decade away. So that's something that in business people, politics and business are going to.
Just to be clear, I don't know when the bond market bubble is going to burst, but what I do know is that the Adam Smith Institute's done an analysis which says that the state pension will become unaffordable in 2035.
Yeah.
The government actuaries say it's 2044 if you infer things from their papers.
But I think another thing which is frustrating for business leaders, particularly in the UK, in wider Europe, is that we just when we're competing against the US, we just can't get the same levels of growth, productivity.
Yes.
How much of that is linked to government?
Oh, it's absolutely. I mean, I am a libertarian. I recognise that the problems that we have are not because government spends too little, taxes too little, regulates too little, has too little debt, or money's too tight. Quite the reverse. We've had huge government, huge spending, huge regulation, huge debt, and easy money. And that is the crisis that we have. So I would love to give business leaders easy answers, but I can't do that. I can only give them the answers that I believe are true. And the true answer is that this has all been brought upon us by a post-war social democratic consensus, which is now collapsing under the weight of its obligations accumulated, together with changing demographics. And you can see, I'm afraid, the stupidity of it, that Rachel Reeves, having promised not to raise taxes on working people, puts up national insurance contributions with devastating effects on business. And one of my frustrations as a Conservative politician has been to watch business leaders just cozy up to whoever's in power because you just got to get on with them. And I can see why they'd want to do that. You don't need the regime uncertainty. You don't need to fall out with ministers. The trouble is that if you do actually believe in a flourishing private sector, the Labour Party is a very bad thing. Are they going to tax you more or less? Are they going to regulate more or less? And they're always going to be on the wrong side of the arguments. Now, at the moment, the Labour Party is being dragged to the right by events. They've got to find the money for more defence spending, so they're going to have to cut benefits because there's nowhere else to go. And when you go through the figures, I tweeted out a thread on it the other day. You just have to go for benefits politically. So they're going to end up cutting benefits and putting up defence spending. They've already cut overseas aid.
Yeah.
Very painful for them. But let's not pretend their heart is in it. And sooner or later, this country is going to need a government that believes what I believe, that government's too big, spends too much, taxes too much, has too much debt, too much unfunded liabilities, and has had too easy money for too long.
And do you think that there is can you credibly draw a line from that to a lack of innovation, a lack of big, fast-growing businesses coming out of Europe versus the US? Because a lot of people say we need that, and that's important for society and for people who are needing those needing that welfare, needing those benefits. And then on the flip side of that is to say, when was the last really big global business in the past 10 years to come out of Belgium or to come out of Scotland or Wales?
Yeah.
There isn't one. And whether you believe in libertarianism or complete free market capitalism or not, it is a fact that large private businesses employ lots of people and do make people richer.
So I think that big government, particularly wrestling with bureaucracy, is absolutely enervating. There's nothing like having more money in your own pocket and the prospect of earning more money in your own pocket to invigorate you to get out there and do things. People talk about the productivity crisis. One of the biggest causes of a productivity crisis is the absolute nonsense you have to do to get on in business. And it just feels endless. I mean, I employ somebody now, and I have to apply for a PAYE number. It's taking months for HMRC to give me a PAYE number so I can employ somebody. So then I've got to give him an emergency pay statement, and we've got to estimate his tax. And it's just hours and hours wasted. Similarly, VAT, and again, it's lovely that I'm back to having invoices and VAT. I've quite enjoyed doing my own bit of administration of my own small company. But it does remind you just how much time is taken up and wasted processing VAT and worrying about what the detail of the rules are and whether or not you can have this lunch on expenses. And, so regulation, I'm absolutely convinced, is really innovating, and taken together with high taxation is ruinous, particularly high taxation on capital. So that book, Return to Growth, that I mentioned, goes through which are the most damaging taxes. And if you want productivity and growth, taxes on business profits, taxes on capital gains, they are absolutely poisonous. The problem is we as Conservatives have for too long given way the moral high ground. The Labour Party scream that we're for big business, and we kind of give in and end up leaving capital taxes high. What we should say is, no, we're for the prosperity of ordinary people. And prosperity of ordinary people relies on increasing productivity. And increasing productivity relies on increasing capital investment. And we're for increasing capital investment. And that means lower taxes on capital. And I'm sorry, if the honourable gentleman opposite doesn't understand that, he shouldn't be in politics. Because I think his constituents should be better off. And the way to make them better off is to reduce taxation on business. And, I've said things like that for years. Much good did it ever do me. But what we have to do, I'm afraid, is dramatically cut spending. Now, I don't like a lot of the tone, the leadership actually style of Donald Trump. I don't like it. It's divisive. It's going to sow poison that's going to go all around the world. Awful. But the good thing they're going to do is they're going to cut spend. They are cutting spending. The Western world needs to dramatically cut spending. It's going to be really painful.
What can business people do in order to promote that agenda? Is it get into politics? Is it comment? Is it support people like you? What can they do?
Well, they're very welcome to support people like me.
Yeah.
Although I'm not going to stand for election again unless something radical changes. I wrote a Substack about this. What I would say to anybody out there with a bit of spare money is actually quite a small amount of money goes a long way in politics. Again, it's in the Substack that I wrote on this, how to be a good donor. But if you're a senator, you have to raise in donations every day, about the amount of money that I'm allowed to spend as an MP once every 5 years.
Right.
So tiny amounts of money go a long way in British politics. If wealthy people want to be a good donor and make a big difference, they can just find people like Josh or like Steve with whom they agree. So never try and buy an opinion, that's corruption. But if you can find a Steve or a Kemi, you think, actually, I agree with Kemi overwhelmingly. And you can say, well, tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you £5,000 a year or £1,000 a year. That's quite a lot of leaflets, and they'll be really grateful. So they'd say to Kemi, I want you to know you'd have my support if you went further on capital taxes for these reasons, because I'd love to invest and raise people's wages. And that's just completely reasonable to do it that way. It's not buying policy. That's supporting someone you agree with, and a little bit of money goes a long way. Because I'm afraid what has happened, people have confused democracy with a market for products. And you can see it with reform at the minute. Conservatives failed in 14 years, so we're going to have a different product and have reform. Well, reform's now falling apart. Unfortunately, the market for politicians and the market for products do not work the same. There is not the same degree of substitution. And what we need is a centre-right party which functions. And I'm afraid what I would say to all of your listeners is, your democracy needs you, and it's ever so inconvenient because it takes up a bit of time. But it doesn't take up much time, and you don't really need to go and knock on any doors. All you really need to do is get to know your candidate or MP or councillor and just embolden them to do more of the things that you like. And just turn up to the Conservative Association, probably only once every other month, and just have a drink with a few people and meet the MP, maybe put £1,000 a year in. You'll be incredibly popular, your voice will be heard, and you'll get bolder, stronger candidates. But I'm afraid democracy belongs to the voter. And I'm afraid we do get the government we deserve as voters. I'm not asking everybody to do what I did and vault the parapet and take all the hits. You don't have to do that. Remain a private person. But for goodness sake, join the political party of your choice.
Would you do it again?
Good God, no.
Why not?
The rewards are extremely thin of being a politician. The risks are extreme, and the costs are very high. It doesn't make a bit of sense to be a member of Parliament. I have achieved some big things that I wanted to achieve, but the one thing I wish I'd known when I set out is no one ever changes their mind on something that's really important to them. That's something I've learned from my new business partner, Professor Paul Dolan. Remain voting, Labour voting, LSE professor. But he and I agreed over COVID, and we formed a business called The Provocation People, which is about embedding tolerance by design. Everybody knows that tolerance is a problem in companies. I get it everywhere I go. You're onto something. We need to be able to agree to disagree more gracefully within firms. So it's about both managing downside risk and also getting the benefits on the upside, that people have got to disagree to become more innovative and productive and make progress. So Paul and I have formed this company, The Provocation People. And in it, I've learned a lot about behavioural science, which I wish I'd known before. But the evidence is, on things that really matter to us, no one ever changes their mind. And I wish I'd known that, because I was hoping to persuade people it was a good idea to leave the EU. And all I've got now is really, I've got thousands of people who absolutely hate my guts and think I'm no good for anything because they disagree with me on the one issue. And Paul's got a book called Beliefism that's coming out, which is what he calls it. And I commend that to people, because this country's got to learn to disagree more gracefully. So on the one hand, I think the things that I have done needed to be done. We needed to have a referendum on the EU. People will disagree. It was necessary for someone to put their hand up and say, do we really need to impose these costs onto society during COVID? Particularly kids' mental health. That's the one that really grieves me. And, sons not being able to hug their mother at the father's funeral. Did we really do that to people? Yeah, we did. And I wasn't in favour of it. But somebody had to stand up for that. And now net zero really can be seen to be vastly too expensive. And I took some huge hits to open that up. So I'm proud, actually, of the things that I've done. But they have, I'm afraid, been very divisive, largely because people won't change their mind about anything that matters to them. Now, if you ask me, would I do it again? No. The sensible thing for me to have done would have been to stay in the city and make as much money as possible, and then give some of that money to political candidates that I supported, and give them some encouragement and some nurture and some more money, and let them know what I thought was a good idea, and let them go and take care of it and take the hits, take the costs, not get the benefits, and have the extreme risks to reputation, which I've had to endure. It doesn't make a bit of sense to be an MP. We're lucky anyone's willing to do it.
Perhaps going back to being the rebellion, was it the rebellion general? The
rebel commander, the general.
Rebel commander.
Yeah.
What differentiates successful from unsuccessful rebellion within organisations?
Well, first and foremost, numbers in Parliament, because you count them up as they go through the lobbies, but also purpose, communications and strategy. So I think that's the point I would make to business leaders. You've really got to know what you're doing, particularly in a crisis. Why are we here? What are we doing? The application of military terms is one thing about military leadership that is applicable, that is different. Selection and maintenance of the aim. Why are we here? What are we trying to do? And that was really important from military to bring to politics. We're trying to do that. So if people know what their purpose is and communicate it effectively, and if they're very clear strategically what they're doing, and everybody uses the word strategy, but remember what strategy means. It means stringing together the different battles in order to overall win the war. So I would say those are the essence of a good parliamentary operation, but they're actually the essence of making your way through any crisis.
Yes. And what's clear from what you've been saying is that you've continually been right at the centre or the leader at times where people have disagreed over things that are fundamental and need to come to some kind of compromise.
Yes.
Having gone through that, what do you think are the things that people can compromise on? Because, as you were saying, it's not going to be things that people deeply believe and care about. They're not necessarily going to move on that. What is it that people can usually move on? And as a business leader, I guess it's times whether it's around the board table or with someone that you're working very closely with, where you have a fundamental disagreement, but yet you have to move forward together.
Yeah.
So what types of things can people find and use to get to some level of agreement?
Well, so discovering the answer to that question is, to me, the essence of a good negotiation. People go into negotiations and they say, I want a 10% pay rise. Well, what they probably ought to be saying is, I don't feel adequately remunerated for the work that I'm doing, the value that I'm bringing. How can we resolve this? Because the employer probably hasn't got the money to give a 10% pay rise, but they might give an extra week's holiday. You see what I mean? So so we did this with the so-called Malthouse Compromise. Kit Malthouse brought together the two warring sides of the Conservative Party to see how we could find some common ground to get through it. I held the pen on the Malthouse Compromise. I named it the Malthouse Compromise. But it was Kit who initiated it. And he brought together Nicky Morgan and Stephen Hammond, myself, Jacob. I'm trying to remember. I think I've forgotten two people. Oh, Damien Green and one other. But we sat and talked and listened. And that is the crucial point. To really listen to one another in good faith when things are extremely difficult. I mean, bear in mind, we thought that the UK Constitution was really being tested to its limits. And once we were in a minority in Theresa May's government of 2017, we had turned, as I said to somebody, we've now gone from a high wire act to a high wire act over an alligator pit. And that's how it felt. So even in those circumstances, where the Conservative Party might have split terminally, we had to find ways to sit down together in good faith and really listen to what both sides wanted. So what the Remain side wanted was to reduce the risks to the economy of leaving without a deal. And what we wanted on the Leave side was to leave the legal structures of the European Union, because that's what we believe a Leave vote meant, just not be within their legal order. Very simple, but people didn't seem to get it. But once we'd really listened to each other, we were able to come up with the Malthouse Compromise. And again, this happened several times. Alternative arrangements in Northern Ireland were rubbished as unicorns and all that, but that is actually now what we've got. It's not quite as good as what I would have liked, but we now do have alternative arrangements in Northern Ireland so that we can have an open border with a foreign country. And likewise, the Malthouse Compromise was rubbished, but if people download the papers off my Twitter feed, they'll see that we have actually basically done the Malthouse Compromise to get out of the EU. So really listening to people, really trying to understand where they're coming from, those are the keys to a good negotiation to get to the point that people can move. Because I do believe that very often, with some exceptions, but certainly in normal business circumstances, there will be a way to get through.
Yeah.
With the Constitution, power is either there or it's there. And Northern Ireland and the EU, it can only be one or the other. But even in Northern Ireland, a way was found through with the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. The violence stopped, and these things are possible.
What one piece of advice, what learning, what piece of wisdom would you pass on to someone else? Because whilst from what it sounds like, I don't wish that there are many Steve Bakers in the future, because it sounds like it's pretty difficult and pretty taxing on your life. But what one piece of wisdom would you pass on to those future people?
What I would say to any leader is have more faith in yourself. I turned up in 2010 with no political experience, thinking, I was in short trousers. But if I'd had more confidence and applied the leadership skills which I'd developed in business and in the armed forces earlier, we might have had fewer difficulties. And so I suppose the advice I wish I'd given myself, which I would give anyone else, is have more confidence that you can apply yourself to be a great leader. But it means winning friends and influencing people. It means listening incredibly carefully. It means always behaving in a way which is tolerant by design. All those things we've been discussing. But it is possible for people listening to this to be great leaders in times of crisis. But it does require resolve, resilience, competence, judgment, listening, emotional intelligence, all those good things.
As a leader, I noticed that some people have been pretty rude about you.
And I've made mistakes.
Sure,
Brexit
of
hard
course.
man.
Sure.
You mentioned the Laura Kuenssberg documentary. I was pictured on it with a tear on my cheek because of the sheer emotional state of an MP I was talking to about how they were going to vote. And in the morning, I was doing an interview, and the interviewer said, "So, Steve, are you okay?" Because she'd seen it. We were off air. I'm like literally in front of the camera like this. But she said to me off air, "Are you okay, Steve?" Oh, yeah, of course. And a journalist had written me up in the morning as Brexit hard man, Steve Baker. So I said to her, everybody knows I'm Brexit hard man, Steve Baker. And she laughed, and I thought it was funny. So I said, "Oh, why didn't you ask me that when the cameras are on?" Oh, what a mistake it was.
Right.
Because now it's not some journalist said it about me. Now Steve Baker's a self-declared Brexit hard man. And it wasn't funny. It was a mistake. And I stumbled into it when I was exhausted and under pressure. And this is a big difference. I said that risks are big.
Yeah.
This doesn't happen to you in business. You don't have to make these decisions and make a little mistake about a joke. And it's on national TV at the height of a crisis.
Yeah.
It cut through to my voters, and there's people in Wickham will never forgive me, think I'm self-declared Brexit hard man, Steve Baker. Worst mistake I ever made.
But that's interesting though, because I think, and maybe this is a point about journalism rather than leadership. But to me, I would imagine that journalist knew that you were joking, right? So is it just, or are they looking for you to say it and then they decide if they think you're joking or not?
There's a Substack on this. Journalists, can't live with them, can't deport them to South Sudan. People will find that for free on my Substack. She's a good journalist, And, you know, I said it was newsworthy. I invited her to ask me on air, so she did. And she wasn't not going to, you know.
Yeah.
And it's just their job. If you offer them something newsworthy, it's their job to take it. They're not there to help you. And so her job wasn't to say, Steve, that might not be a good idea. That's not a journalist's job.
And how do you? Because I think there was another journalist that was very rude about you. I think was
There's
caught.
so many.
I think it was a Channel 4 journalist. I forget his name.
Krishnan and Guru
yeah,
Murthy called me the C word.
Yeah, he was calling camera.
Yeah.
But what I was.
He was suspended for it, and he has apologised, and we
Right,
have buried the hatchet, and we now are in touch, and we're great friends.
But I was interested that you accepted his apology.
I'm a Christian.
Quite quickly. But I was thinking there is a when you're in that position, it's interesting because there's a lot of people who won't forgive you for what they think that you've done wrong or the things that you've said or whatever. Yeah. But you have been much more forgiving. And how does that work in your mind?
You asked me earlier about basis for decisions, and I was really clear that politicians must decide on secular grounds. But in the end, the thing that is most important to me is to be a Christian. I believe in God, and I believe in the basic doctrines of mere Christianity. And that means I am under a command to love even my enemies. So to bless those who curse me. Now, this might seem too pious for some people. I tell you what, look at me. Do I look bothered about the hatred of those people? Well, sometimes I am, but not normally. It doesn't stick with me. I'm not bitter. I don't carry it around. I'm not worried that other people hate me. I feel sorry for them. Because it's the bitterness, their unforgiveness of me. It's not harming me, it's harming them. And I'm sorry for them over that, but it's easy for me to forgive them because they don't know me. It's that beliefism point with Dolan. And again, with leaders, I would commend leaders, this attitude to leaders. What other people think of you, you can't tell them to think differently about you. And if they've disagreed with it, particularly if you've made somebody redundant and it's threatening their mortgage and their kids, they're not going to forgive you that. But if you did the right thing and you're sure you did the right thing, you can forgive them their curses and you can move on. But you've got to be sure you did the right thing. So if people are going to be rapacious and sack people who don't need to be sacked, that is a very bad thing. They shouldn't do that. But if it's necessary to merge two companies and make some redundancies to save both companies and make progress, that's the right thing to do rather than have everybody lose their job. But the people you make redundant may hate you. But to me, I'm afraid that I've been a Christian a long time. Well, I'm glad to have been a Christian a long time. And it wasn't really until I became a politician and people were really cursing me that I realised the value of Christianity, practical value of Christianity, that you just have to bless those who curse you.
When I look back at my life, there's been times that I've been bitter, there's been times that I've been forgiving, and I think that I try to go down the road of always be forgiving, as you say, to love your enemies. But also, I think what I realise as I run a business, as I go through life, is that you're really not in control of nearly as much as you think. Sometimes you're not really in control of anything, and there is a certain detachment that you just have to have, which is I can control what I do, but I can't control how people react. I can't control how people perceive it. I know that I will make mistakes. I kind of can't. I can try not to, but I can't control when those mistakes will happen. And so actually there is an element, I think, of being a leader where you have to just get really comfortable that stuff will go wrong, stuff will go out, stuff will be out of your control. And sometimes that's probably most of the time that has negative implications. Hopefully sometimes it has positive implications, but you just kind of have to come to terms with that. Yeah. And if you don't recognize that, and if you don't forgive people who don't like you, I imagine it can drive you crazy. I mean, clearly it hasn't happened with you, but are there colleagues that you've had in Parliament where that's really eaten them up? Absolutely.
And ambition's a terrible thing. I did make it clear that if I'd won my seat, I would have run to lead the Conservative Party. Why? Because I think I'd do a good job. Now, people will disagree with me, but they will disagree with me. But I have seen that some people, it's just about becoming leader of the party. Right. And if they don't get it, they're so wickedly bitter. And I've watched particularly people sacked from government office. Oh, they're wicked as they go round. Their whole demeanour and character changes because they think it's over for them. And they very often come back But ambition, frustrated ambition. The thing is, what does it mean to be a human being? Who do we want to become? How do we want to grow? And what effect do we want to have on other people? That's a normal question of life. Altogether, too few people ask that question of themselves every day. But we should reflect and think, who am I? Who am I becoming? What does it mean for other people? That question becomes extremely acute in any leadership position. It becomes especially acute if you're representing 75,000 people, only a third of whom voted for you, perhaps quite reluctantly, and you're affecting the life of the whole nation. It becomes really exceptionally acute. I'm pleased to say that in my own case, I think I've managed to navigate all these things broadly to my satisfaction. But in any leadership role, people should know that they got my sympathy as they navigate this question of who are they, who do they want to become, what can they control, what can't they? And I think this process of becoming, whatever one's faith or whatever, this process of becoming is the essence of life, and it is the privilege of those who lead to live out that essence of life more acutely than those who follow. And good on them for trying it and doing it.
Where can people find you?
On stevebaker.info. So if people want me to go and do a one-off speech or board, roundtable or whatever, just go to stevebaker.info. If they want me and Paul Dolan to come in and help them embed tolerance by design, it's theprovocationpeople.com.
Super. And you mentioned your Substack as well. How can they find that?
fightingforafreefuture.substack.com, but it's linked from my stevebaker.info. But if they Google Substack, Fighting for a Free Future.
Super. Steve, thank you very much.
You're most welcome.
Thank you for listening to Air Supply from JO Collective. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Of course, you can leave a review, preferably a positive one. And see you soon. Thank you.